Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. And welcome to today's video where I'm going to be painting this Berserker character from the new Cyberpunk Red Combat Zone. So when I picked this guy up and looked at him, he gave me really strong Borderlands vibes. So that was kind of the inspiration I took for him. So we'll start off painting the armor at the top and then moving on to the pants. And to save time on the video, I'll just mention up front that every single coat of paint or every single color of paint had to go on twice. So everything got 2 coats, but rather than actually show you me painting on both coats, I'll just show you doing the first one, and then you go back over and repaint it. So no need showing you the same thing, and I can cut the video time in half. In fact, actually literally. So after doing the armor here and the pants, and then I can kind of just go back and forth. By the time I finish painting the armor on top, the pants are dry and I can move on to there for the most part. When you're painting one model, you kind of have to jump around so that you don't end up painting over paint that's still kind of wet. So with the pants, you'll notice after that first coat, it's not covering it very well. That's why you have to do 2 coats, and in some cases like this, when you're painting something like orange or yellow over top of a black base coat, you're definitely going to have to do 2 coats and most likely 3. Now I found that the GW Jacaro Orange is still a really solid paint, and after maybe 2 or 3 coats, usually 2 is enough, you got yourself that nice base coat to work with. Now when it comes to skin, I like a mix of variety but simplicity. So I usually have 2 different methods for fair skin tone, dark skin tone, and middle skin tone. And for the 2 fair skin tones, both of them I start with the Bugman's Glow. It's just a nice base. It's easier to cover up the black base coat with the Bugman's Glow. And then on top, I end up using either Kislev Flesh or Cadian Flesh tone. Now the Kislev Flesh is very bright, as you'll see in a minute when I put it on. But for now, as before, 2 coats of Bugman's Glow to give us a nice foundation. I also noticed at this point I forgot to paint his shoes. I was debating whether or not to do them a color, but then I figured, nah, we'll just stick with silver. They look very bionic, so we'll go with it. I find the Fuegan Orange is a really good help to establishing a nice, deep orange color. You could go straight to highlighting straight from that base coat of Jacaro Orange, but the shade helps to give you that bit of depth. It adds a little bit of boldness to the color itself, because orange and yellow, as anyone who's tried painting with them know, they're really tough to work with. And so the wash for me is pretty much a standard, just to make sure the color is solidified. And then I'll go back over it with the initial Jacaro Orange and paint over the higher areas, leaving the recesses with the shade. And I usually get a really nice basic orange color. This step is kind of optional, especially if you're wanting your model to have very bright, shiny armor. You don't have to do the Nuln Oil wash. I like to do it just because it helps to set apart the different armor plates by seeping into those really tiny cracks and crevices that you might not always be able to pull out just from highlighting. But it will darken the overall effect of the armor unless you want to go back over and paint it again. So this step's optional. I choose to use it. Now, as we start to add this first layer of the lighter skin tone, your first reaction might be to scream and drop the brush. It's bright. It's very bright. It's almost a yellowish skin tone, and by itself, I usually only use it as a highlight. But I want to give this guy a paler kind of look to him, so after we put this on, don't worry about it. Once we put the flesh shade on, it will darken it right down, and it'll start to look more like a flesh shade rather than, you know, some kind of awful parchment. Now I'm still on the lookout for the perfect 3-color mixture for orange. Citadel Paints does put out 3 different orange colors, but they're not the dark, medium, and light that you'd usually use. So what I do for now with orange is Jacaro Orange is my base coat, then I put the shade over it to darken the whole thing down, and then Jacaro Orange actually becomes my second medium tone, and then I use Fire Dragon Bright here over just the raised areas, you know, the sharpest edges of the cloth. You also got to paint his backside there because the sun's going to hit it, and that's what ends up giving me that 3-layer tone. So I am in the market. If anyone knows of other paint companies that make some oranges that might work a little bit better.
Now I did end up putting one more coat of the Fire Dragon Bright on the pants, but while I was waiting for the first coat to dry fully, I decided to grab some of the Vallejo Black and kind of tidy up some of the messes on the belt. As I've been painting the pants, occasionally a little paint has gotten up onto the belt, so giving you that nice crisp distinction between where the belt ends and the beginning of the pants begin. And then later on you also see you'll have to go in and paint the belt loops that the belt goes through, but you do those last. Okay, so now we get to the highlight because the wash on the armor has been dried. So Ironbreaker is probably your best go-to. You could jump straight to Runefang Steel, but that might be a little bit too much. With the Ironbreaker, you just get edges and fronts. So the toes, the front of the foot, and then on, as you'll see on the armor padding here, you get the tops, you get the edges, just highlight parts. You don't want to cover the whole thing because then he might look a little bit too bright and shiny. You don't want him looking like a tin can. You want him to look metallic. So now we're going to add a little bit of character to this, make him really stick out. So we'll start off with a darker red. I mean, Mephiston red usually isn't that dark, but you could use corn red or any kind of really deep red if you want. But you want a dark, a medium, and a light. And the lightest is going to be, for this case, is almost going to be orange. So you paint in not every space. You're not trying to kind of reverse outline the model, but just imagine if there was energy coursing through the plates of armor. The whole thing wouldn't be lit up at once. So I'm going to paint some of these red lines all over the armor in different spots, but not everywhere, to make sure you get that effect that there's motion, that the energy beams are actually coursing through and around the armor. Just make sure that you have a nice fine brush, that the paint stays wet so that it doesn't, so that it flows nicely into those cracks and crevices, and take your time. This is one of those parts where there's no quick way to do it. You just have to take your time. Now while we're waiting for that dark red to dry within the armor plating, we can now start to highlight the armor plating itself. Now some might want to do this first before you start painting in the crevices, some might do it the other way. There's always a chance that you're going to slip and accidentally put some silver on the red, or while you're painting in the red you slip and put it on the silver. So I don't think it really matters which way you do it. Just be prepared if you make a mistake to go back and paint over it. As long as your paints are nice and thin and you're not gobbing it on there, repairing anything is relatively simple. When you're highlighting the plating here, you just want to get edges, top portions, anywhere where the light's definitely going to hit, or where you want to most definitely distinguish a lighter area and a darker area. Okay, I promised that we'd come back and fix the flesh, and now's time. So using just simple Reichland Fleshblade, you don't even have to gob it on very much. Just make sure you paint on enough to cover it, that there's enough for the cracks and the recessed areas for the wash to flow into it. And it still looks like a pretty bright flesh color, but by the time you let it dry, it will have darkened it down and it will simply look like a lighter colored flesh, but it won't look like that awful yellow tinge that we saw previously. My typical flesh scheme is to go from Bugman's Glow to Cadian Flesh Tone and then use Kislev as the highlight, but you can also change it and do Bugman's Glow, then Kislev, and then use the Kislev as its own highlight over top of the wash. I noticed while I was painting too that I forgot to get these little bolts sticking out the side of his pants, so quickly just grab some extra silver that I still had on the palette and take care of those. I'm also going to put on that last layer of orange. In this case, it's not going to necessarily lighten anything up, but it's going to bolden whatever areas I've already colored. It's also here that I'll put on a couple coats, very tiny little stripes on top of those pants, to make the belt look like a belt. Now, if you thought you had to go slow and take your time on the energy beams, here you have to go even more so, because if you mess up, you got to redo all that orange, and that can be a disaster, or at least very, very time consuming. So go very slow, take your time, make sure you have a good steady grip on the model and the brush so nothing accidentally slips, and you'll do just fine. So now we'll paint the mask, and as I said, I was getting very strong Borderland vibes with this guy, so we'll go with a white mask. Just like with my flesh tone, with my armor, I like to just have a go-to scheme that I can work with and get really comfortable with so I can paint quickly. So in this case, you start with that base coat of Celestra Gray. When it dries, it will look a little darker than it does when it's wet. Right now it looks very, very white, but it will darken to a gray. And while I'm waiting for that face mask to dry, now we come in and just do some subtle highlights on fingertips, on ridges of hands, and then maybe a little bit on the top of the skull, just to highlight the flesh. And suddenly, that first layer of Kislev flesh in the wash looks a lot darker when you've got the pure Kislev flesh on top acting as your highlight. Once we've got the highlights of the flesh now, we're on to just the last details. We are just about finished here. So again, using the Vallejo Black, I'm going to be painting the bands that are holding the mask in place. We'll also, if necessary, go back and touch up the pockets on the pants there, and just make sure that we get a nice solid black color for when we're ready to highlight. So when it comes time to highlighting black, there's a couple different methods I like to use. Whether I want it to look kind of like a blue steel or kind of a slick look, or whether I want it to have more of a grungy, dirty look. And in this case, we want to go with the dirty one. So you can either start with Eschen Gray, Mechanicus Standard Gray, or even Skavenblight Dinge, which has a nice brown tint to it and will really, really look grungy. But in this case, I'm going to use the Mechanicus Standard Gray. It's a little bit brighter, and since this guy is pretty darn bright with his bright pants and his shining armor, I wanted the pockets on the pants here to stick out a little bit more too. So I decided to go with the Mechanicus Standard Gray as my darker highlight, and then once I've got those details picked out, then I'll go back over them with Dawnstone and just hit the very corners and edges. So now we come in and do a really quick highlight with the Dawnstone, just hitting corners, top ridges, areas where the folds come to a point. This part's pretty quick because there's not a lot of areas that need it, but don't go too fast and accidentally, smear the paint or something like that. Now that the face mask is dry, we're going to tidy up those eye sockets, I guess you call them, those little telescopic lenses that are coming out of the eyes there. Okay, so now let's shift to finishing off the armor here and making that laser effect look really good. So getting your medium color, because you can do this with red, blue, purple, green, whatever color you want. Paint the lighter color, or the medium tone, about halfway, covering the darker one. So you're not going entirely over. If you paint a line so long, half that line to maybe about a third of it should be covered by the medium tone. And then with your final lightest color, whether it be your brightest yellow, an orange, really lime green, something like that, you'll now get just a tiny area at the end of the medium tone. And that will give it that effect that there's a beam of light moving through the plating and you just see the after image in your eye following along behind with the darker red. And I think it looks really good.
the mask, I'm only going to do one level of highlight. So Ulthuan Gray is the perfect highlight for Celestra Gray. I don't want the mask to be a super bright white, so I'm just going to do this first layer of highlight. Usually I'd come back with White Scar and get tips and highest edges to give it a much brighter look, but I'm not going for a super bright white look on the mask. So just get the corners, the edges, outline the basic shape of the mask, and you're all done. The very last thing is to do a tiny Mechanicus Standard Gray highlight across the top half of the telescoping eyes, just to separate them from the bottom, from the rest of the model, and to let the eye know that there's a break in the model there. And with that done, we are all finished. So there it is. I hope you found the video enjoyable or useful. It may not win you a Golden Demon, but it's good enough.